She buried her father on a Tuesday. She buried her husband's empire on a Wednesday. The difference? Her father knew he was dying. Her husband never saw it coming. If you've ever watched someone smile while they destroyed you, slowly, quietly, without lifting a finger, then you already know what kind of woman Celestine Virelli is. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and follow along. Because what happens in the next 2 hours will make you rethink everything you know about power, betrayal, and the kind of woman men always underestimate. The morning they buried Vittorio Virelli, the sky over Manhattan refused to cooperate with grief. It was sharp and blue and merciless, the kind of November sky that offers no comfort, no drama, no poetic permission to fall apart. The sun came up anyway, indifferent to the fact that one of the most dangerous men in the Western Hemisphere was about to be lowered into the ground. The trees lining Fifth Avenue had already surrendered their leaves. Everything looked stripped bare, cleaned out, like the city had been preparing for this without being told. Celestine Virelli stood at the top of the cathedral steps at 7:43 in the morning and watched the black cars arrive. She wore a dress the color of midnight, no jewelry, no veil, no theatrics. Her hair was pulled back so severely it could have been mistaken for punishment. She was 34 years old, and she looked, to every person who glanced at her that morning, like a woman simply enduring the worst day of her life. That was the first lie she told them. She told it without opening her mouth. The cars kept coming. Long and black and identical, they pulled up one after another along the curb outside St. Sebastian's, their engines cutting off with that particular silence that expensive vehicles make. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of restraint. She watched them climb out. Men in dark suits with thick necks and careful eyes. Women draped in mourning clothes that cost more than most people's mortgages. A senator from Georgia who had never once publicly acknowledged knowing Vittorio Virelli. A shipping magnate from Rotterdam who flew in last night and whose hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly as he buttoned his coat. 3 men from a Frankfurt investment group who had not spoken to her father in 6 years but owed him, quietly and completely, the survival of their careers. They came because Vittorio Virelli's death was not simply the death of a man, it was the end of an arrangement, the closing of an account. And every single person climbing those cathedral steps this morning needed to see with their own eyes that the account had closed, that the hand that had protected them, threatened them, and occasionally saved them from their own worst decisions had finally gone still. Celestine watched them all. She stood straight. Her expression was composed in the particular way that women in her family learned early. Not frozen, not performative, but genuinely unreachable. Her father had spent 20 years teaching her that face. He called it the sovereign's face. The face you wear, he told her once, when you already know the outcome of a room and you're waiting for everyone else to catch up. She had not cried since Thursday. Not because she didn't love him. She had loved Vittorio Virelli the way you love a fire that warms you and could burn you, and has never once asked your permission. Completely, cautiously, with a kind of reverence that left no room for sentimentality. She hadn't cried because crying belonged to people who were surprised by loss. She had watched her father die by increments over 14 months. She had sat beside him in the study on the 4th floor of the Virelli townhouse on East 68th Street while he went through every document, every trust instrument, every encrypted file, every hidden account and silent partnership and offshore structure. And she had watched him dismantle the empire he spent 40 years constructing and rebuild it, brick by brick, into something her husband would never touch. There was no surprise left in her, only the work that remained. She turned when she heard the door behind her open and Marcus appeared at her shoulder. He was 61, built like a man who had been a problem for other men his entire adult life, and he had been her father's head of security since before Celestine was born. Now, technically, he worked for her. They had discussed this transition 3 weeks ago in quiet, clinical terms, and neither of them had found it necessary to make it emotional. "Ronan's car is 4 minutes out," Marcus said. His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man reporting weather. Celestine said nothing. "He's not alone," Marcus added. She had already known that. She had known it since 11 o'clock the previous night when her contact at the parking garage on West 49th, a man named Elliot, who had worked for her father for 9 years and who Ronan believed was simply a garage attendant, sent a 2-word text message. "She's coming." She tucked that information away the same way she tucked everything away. Clean, quiet, behind a face that gave nothing. "I'll be inside," she said. The cathedral was already half filled by the time she walked down the center aisle toward the front pew. She could feel the room shift as she moved through it, the slight adjustment of postures, the redirected glances, the muted conversations that fell away as she passed. She recognized most of the faces. She had grown up watching these people from the edges of rooms, silent and observant. The daughter nobody paid much attention to because Vittorio had designed it that way. He had kept her hidden from the world's gaze, not out of shame, but out of strategy. "You cannot threaten what you cannot see," he told her, "and you cannot steal what you cannot find." She sat in the front pew and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the casket. It was dark mahogany, simple by his request. He had told her once that powerful men who insist on elaborate funerals are men who spent their lives unsure whether they mattered. He had been sure. He wanted a box and the ground and whatever she needed to say to him before they closed it. She'd said it on Thursday evening. She had sat alone beside him in the room on the 4th floor that smelled of cedar and old paper, and she had spoken for 40 minutes to a man who could no longer hear her, but who she was absolutely certain, in some way that had nothing to do with logic, was still listening. She had told him what she was going to do. She had told him it was already in motion. She had told him that the man he had spent the last 14 months helping her quietly destroy would not see it coming because men like Ronan Valieri had a fundamental architectural flaw. They only looked forward. They never looked down at the ground beneath their feet. When she finished, she had pressed her hand flat against his chest one time. Then she stood up, smoothed her clothes, and walked out. She had not gone back. The cathedral filled. The murmur of expensive grief thickened the air. She stared at the casket and breathed steadily and waited. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps. The footsteps of 100 people were moving through this space. She heard him in the way a room changes when a man who believes he owns it walks in. There was a subtle shift in the ambient noise, a slight compression of whispers into silence. And then Celestine heard the specific quality of attention that Ronan Valieri generated wherever he went, the held breath of people waiting to see what he would do next. She did not turn around. She heard the footsteps come up the aisle. She heard them stop. Then she heard a second set, lighter, slower, a woman's footsteps. Celestine kept her eyes forward. Ronan slid into the pew beside her. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the Brioni, the one he saved for events where he needed to remind people who he was. His cologne arrived 3 seconds before he did. She had always found that particular detail telling, a man who telegraphed himself. He settled in beside her and did not immediately speak, which she recognized as his version of contrition, the silence of a man who has done something he knows was wrong but cannot bring himself to name it. What he did not know was that the silence between them was no longer a married silence. It was a strategic one. The second set of footsteps had stopped 2 pews back. She let 7 full seconds pass before she turned her head and looked at him. Ronan Valieri was 41 years old, and he was objectively a striking man. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been built for photographing, eyes the color of old whiskey, warm at first glance. But there was something behind them that had always unsettled her, something that only revealed itself once you knew what you were looking at. The particular blankness of a person who looked at other people and saw primarily utility. She had loved him anyway. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, even now. She had loved him the way you love something that was partly real, not entirely a lie, but not entirely true either. A translation with errors you don't discover until it's too late to go back. He met her eyes. His were guarded, careful. He was trying to read her. She gave him nothing. "Celestine," he said, low, controlled, the voice he used when he was managing a situation. "Ronan," she said, "I'm sorry about Vittorio." The words came out polished and hollow, the grief equivalent of a form letter. He had rehearsed them. She could hear the rehearsal underneath. "Thank you for coming," she said. Something flickered in his face. Surprise at her composure, maybe, or something sharper. The expression resolved itself quickly into the measured look he used in boardrooms. He nodded once. He settled in beside her. She turned her eyes back to the casket. Behind them, Viviana De Luca sat 2 rows back with her coat buttoned high and her face turned slightly toward the stained glass. She was 27 years old and visibly pregnant, perhaps 6 months, though Celestine had not allowed herself to calculate too precisely. She had dark hair and the particular bearing of a woman who had been told, repeatedly and recently, that she had won something. Celestine had seen the photograph of her exactly once, pulled from an encrypted file on a Thursday night in October while sitting in the dark in her father's study, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she had identified clinically because that was how she'd been taught, as pain. She had allowed herself 45 seconds of it. Then she had closed the file and picked up a pen and written 3 words on a legal pad. Build the cage. Those 3 words had become 14 months of quiet, meticulous, invisible work. The ceremony began. Celestine sat through it with the kind of stillness that cost. Every muscle held, every breath measured. The men at the podium spoke about Vittorio Virelli in the acceptable language of power, visionary, titan, patriarch, legacy. And they weren't wrong exactly. They were just describing a photograph of a man rather than the man himself. The real Vittorio Virelli would have found the entire proceeding professionally adequate and personally insufferable. He had hated sentiment. He had believed that excessive emotion in public spaces was a form of vulnerability, and vulnerability, in his world, was an invitation. She missed him in a way that had no useful outlet. Twice during the ceremony, she felt Ronan's eyes on the side of her face. She ignored them both times. He was trying to gauge her, trying to understand what her silence meant, what her composure meant, whether her grief had left her pliable. She understood his methodology because she had watched it operate for 7 years. The way he took readings of rooms, calculated weakness, looked for the moment when someone was most susceptible to pressure. He would find nothing. She had made sure of that. When the final speaker stepped back from the podium and the room shifted into the standing, shuffling choreography of a ceremony's end, Celestine rose with everyone else. She accepted the condolences that came to her, brief, firm handshakes, murmured words she acknowledged with nods. The senator from Georgia gripped her hand too long and looked at her with something that might have been pity or calculation, and she smiled at him in a way that made him release her quickly. She was moving toward the side door when Ronan appeared at her shoulder again. "We need to talk," he said. "Not a request." "We do," she agreed. "Not today." "Celestine, my father was buried an hour ago, Ronan." She kept her voice even. "Whatever it is, it will keep." He fell back a half step. She continued to the door. Outside, the November air cut through her coat immediately. She stood at the top of the side steps and breathed it in, cold and diesel-tinged and brutally real, and let herself, for exactly 3 seconds, simply feel the weight of the morning. Then Marcus appeared at her elbow with a phone. "He's been calling the attorneys," Marcus said quietly. "Started last night." She took the phone and looked at the name on the screen. Harlan Frost, Ronan's lead attorney, a man who billed at $900 an hour and who had built a reputation over 30 years on the particular art of dismantling other people's assets in divorce proceedings. "How many calls?" she asked. 4. 1 last night, 3 this morning. Celestine handed the phone back. "Let him call. He'll move fast. He always does." She looked out at the line of black cars pulling away from the curb. "That's his only real strategy. Move before the other person is ready." She smoothed a crease in her coat that didn't exist. "He doesn't know we've been ready for 14 months. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "How are you holding up?" She considered the question genuinely, which surprised her. "I'll let you know when there's time to find out," she said. She went down the steps toward the waiting car. The drive back to the townhouse took 22 minutes. She sat in the back seat and looked out the window and let herself think, which was a luxury she had been too careful to afford lately. The city moved past in its relentless way, people rushing, cabs cutting lanes, scaffolding draped in green netting, steam rising from grates in the pavement. New York City had never once adjusted its pace for anyone's grief, and she had always found that, strangely, comforting. The world's indifference was its own form of steadiness. She thought about her father. She thought about the night 16 months ago when he had called her into his study and closed the door and set a folder on the desk between them without speaking. She had opened it. Inside were 2 things: the results of a medical scan, aggressive pancreatic cancer, stage 4, prognosis 14 to 18 months, and a 6-page document outlining what he had already discovered about Ronan Valieri's financial activities over the previous 8 months. She had read both documents carefully. When she finished, she closed the folder and set it back on the desk. "How long have you known?" she asked. She meant both things. "About the cancer, 3 weeks," he said. "About Ronan, 4 months. Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at her the way he always looked at her when she asked a question he expected her to eventually answer herself. "Because I needed to know what he would do when he thought he was unobserved. Men behave according to their true nature when they believe there are no consequences. I needed to see his true nature." "And?" "He negotiated with the DeLuca family." Her father's voice was quiet and absolutely without inflection. "He offered them portions of our infrastructure, shipping routes, 3 holding companies, access to financial channels we spent decades constructing. He offered them to Marco DeLuca in exchange for a merger, business and otherwise." He paused. "His child with Viviana DeLuca is expected in the spring." She remembered the specific quality of that silence. It wasn't shock exactly. It was something more structural. The feeling of a load-bearing wall giving way inside her chest. She had known, in the way you know things you're not ready to know, that something had been wrong for over a year. The distance between them. The nights he came home late and slept too soundly. The way he had begun, gradually and then suddenly, to look at her as furniture. She hadn't named it because naming it required deciding what to do about it, and she had not yet been ready. "What do you want to do?" she asked her father. He folded his hands on the desk. "I want to build a structure so complete that there is nothing left for him to take. Not a legal challenge, not a custody dispute, not a negotiated settlement." His eyes were steady and absolutely clear. "I want him to believe until the moment the doors close that he is winning. And then I want him to understand, completely, irrevocably, that he was never playing the game he thought he was playing." She had looked at her father for a long moment. "Teach me," she said. And he did. For 14 months, between the quiet hours when the medical staff came and went, between the procedures that bought him time, he spent entirely on this problem. Vittorio Varelli dismantled and rebuilt his empire with a precision that was, even by his own standards, extraordinary. Every trust restructured, every offshore account transferred, every silent partnership rewired to run exclusively through instruments bearing Celestine's name alone. 3 new foundations established under the laws of 3 different jurisdictions: the townhouse, the penthouse, the properties in Geneva and Capri and outside Kyoto. Moved. The casinos, the shipping interests, the security companies, the investment vehicles, all of it placed, systematically and legally, beyond the reach of any instrument Ronan might deploy. And Ronan, busy with Viviana and his ambitions and his private negotiations with the DeLuca family, noticed nothing. Because Ronan Valieri, for all his shrewdness, had a blind spot the size of a continent, he could not imagine that the quiet woman in his house was more than decoration. He had been living in a kingdom and mistaking the silence of its queen for the compliance of a subject. It was, Vittorio had told her, the most reliable weakness in certain kinds of men, the ones who had educated themselves into power without ever learning the difference between authority and arrangement. They confused tolerance for acceptance. They confused silence for submission. They built elaborate structures on foundations they had never examined because they had never imagined the foundations could be moved. "He will come for the inheritance," her father had told her, in one of their last conversations, when his voice had gone thin and his hands had taken on that particular translucence that came near the end. "He believes I'm worth something to him dead that I was not worth to him alive. He's planned this. He has attorneys, he has documentation he thinks is evidence, he has a strategy." His mouth curved slightly. "Let him bring it. And when he does, you'll have a room ready for him. And in that room, he will learn that the empire he's been borrowing for 7 years was never his to inherit." She had pressed his hand then. He had not pressed back. He no longer had the strength, but his fingers had tightened for a moment around hers. That was enough. He died on a Sunday evening at 7:15, in the study where he had spent most of his adult life. Surrounded by files he had spent his last months reorganizing into weapons his daughter would use without him. It was, she had thought, an entirely appropriate death for the man he was. Back at the townhouse, she changed out of the funeral dress and put on slacks and a gray cashmere sweater and sat at the desk in the study on the fourth floor. The room still smelled of him, the cedar and old paper, and the particular faint smell of gauloise that he had given up 12 years ago, but that seemed, impossibly, to have soaked permanently into the walls. She sat at his desk, in his chair, in front of his monitors, and she worked. There was a great deal of work. The attorneys, her attorneys, not Ronan's, though Ronan did not yet know she had retained separate counsel, had been preparing for months. A team of 7, led by a woman named Adeze Okafor, who charged more than Harlan Frost and had never once lost a structural asset case, had been working through 3 layers of trusts to ensure that every transfer was defensible, every instrument clean, every document time-stamped and witnessed and registered in the appropriate jurisdictions before Vittorio drew his last breath. It was clean. It was complete. Ronan was already calling Frost. That was fine. Let Frost come. Let him run the searches, pull the records, find the filings. Let the moment of discovery happen in a conference room with fluorescent lights and recycled air and the quiet, devastating efficiency of documents that could not be argued with. She was thinking about the timeline. 3 days, she estimated, before Ronan made his formal move, possibly 2 if his desperation was running higher than she'd calculated, when her phone buzzed on the desk. It was not a number she recognized. She let it ring once, twice. Then she picked it up. Celestine Virelli. A pause. Then a woman's voice, young, carefully controlled, with something running under the control like water under ice. This is Viviana De Luca. Celestine said nothing. I know this is... The woman stopped, started again. I know what you must think of me. I don't think anything about you, Celestine said, which was not entirely true but was precise enough. What do you want? Another pause. Celestine waited. She was very good at waiting. I need you to know, Viviana said, that I didn't know about what he was doing with the companies, with your father's. Her voice frayed slightly at the edges. I didn't know he was offering them things that weren't his to offer. Celestine kept her voice neutral. How did you get this number? My father's people found it. I made them give it to me. A breath. I'm not calling for Ronan. I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, I'm not part of it. Celestine considered this for a moment. The sound of the woman's voice was interesting to her. Not because it changed anything, but because it was data. Viviana De Luca was 27 years old and 6 months pregnant, and apparently intelligent enough to see which way the wind was turning before most people had opened their windows. What happens next has already been decided, Celestine said. It was decided before my father died. Your involvement or non-involvement in Ronan's decisions doesn't affect the outcome. I understand that. The voice was quieter now. She stopped. Say what you called to say. A long pause. Is he going to be destroyed? Celestine looked at the window. Outside, the November sky had gone the color of pewter, and the city's lights were beginning to come up through the early dark. He's going to be removed, she said carefully, from things he was never entitled to. What happens after that depends entirely on choices he hasn't made yet. She paused. But I wouldn't plan your child's future around his resources. That would be my suggestion. Silence on the line. Then, I see. Is that all? Yes, Viviana said. I'm sorry for your loss. Celestine sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the line went dead. She set it face down on the desk. She was quiet for a while. Then she pulled up the document she needed and began to read through it for the 11th time, looking for anything she might have missed. She found nothing. She had not expected to find anything, but thoroughness was a habit she had no intention of breaking. At 8:30, Marcus knocked on the open door. Frost reached out to Adese's office, he said. He's requesting a preliminary meeting, day after tomorrow. Tell her to agree to it, Celestine said without looking up. Location of her choosing. He'll want it at his office, neutral ground. His office is not neutral ground. It's psychological theater designed to make opposing counsel feel like visitors. She turned a page. Adese's conference room, downtown. He can come to us. Marcus made a note on the pad he carried. Anything else? She thought for a moment. The penthouse. Change the entry codes tonight. Have the master key transferred to my access exclusively. She paused. Don't make a production of it. Just do it. He'll notice. He'll notice on Thursday morning when he tries to go back there after the meeting. She looked up. I want him to notice on Thursday morning after the meeting, not before. Marcus looked at her steadily. He had served her father for 30 years and her for a matter of days, and she could see in his face the particular process of recalibration that happens when you realize the person you've been watching become someone is already fully formed. Understood, he said. He was almost out the door when she spoke again. Marcus. He turned. My father trusted you with everything, she said. I want you to know that I understand the weight of that. And I want you to know that trust is not something I expect automatically. It's something we'll build. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not sentimentality, but recognition, the way one careful person recognizes another. Your father said you'd say something like that, he told her. What did he say after that? He said he'd taught you well. Marcus paused at the door. He said you were going to be better at it than he was. After he left, she sat alone in the study that smelled of cedar and old paper and absent cigarettes, and she did not cry. She worked for another 3 hours in the quiet, and when she was done, she went to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere to the south, in the penthouse on the 48th floor that she had just reclaimed with a 4-digit code change, Ronan Valieri was on the phone with Harlan Frost, building a strategy out of assumptions. He believed he was moving fast. He believed he was ahead of a grieving widow who didn't understand what she had inherited. He was moving fast, yes, but the tracks he was running on had already been removed. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass. Somewhere in the city, a woman named Adaeze Okafor was in an office preparing a document package that would be ready in 48 hours. Somewhere in 3 different jurisdictions, trust instruments bearing Celestine's name alone were filed and registered and entirely legally unassailable. Somewhere in the Virelli financial architecture, a structure Ronan had lived inside for 7 years without ever understanding its true dimensions. Every door had been quietly closed. Every lock had been turned. Every window had been sealed from the inside. He would come to that room in 2 days. He would bring Frost and his assumptions and his carefully prepared strategy and his absolute certainty that he was about to collect something he had earned. And in that room, she was going to hand him a mirror. What happened after that was not something she had planned in detail. She had not planned it because she didn't need to. The structure was complete. The only thing remaining was the moment. The specific, crystallizing instant when Ronan Valieri sat across from her and understood, fully and finally, that the entire architecture of his life had been built on borrowed ground. She had been waiting for that moment for 14 months. She was not in a hurry. Outside, the city burned and hummed and continued its relentless, indifferent forward motion, and Celestine Virelli stood in her father's study and breathed and waited, and was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely at peace. The meeting was set for Thursday. Ronan didn't know it yet. But on Wednesday evening, something happened that none of them had planned for. A phone call that arrived at 11:47 at night from a number that belonged to a man who was supposed to be Ronan's most loyal ally. A man who had been inside the Virelli network for 11 years and who Celestine had assumed until that exact moment was on her side. She picked up the phone and heard 3 words that changed the timeline of everything. The phone felt heavier than it should have. Celestine stood at the window of her father's study, the city burning orange and white 40 feet below her, and she held the phone against her ear and listened to the voice of a man named Dario Sede tell her that everything she thought she had locked down was not entirely locked down. Dario Sede was 53 years old. He had been inside the Virelli network since Celestine was in her early 20s, a financial architect, the kind of man who existed in the spaces between legitimate accounting and the other kind, fluent in both languages, trusted by Vittorio for over a decade. She had assumed, operating on her father's assessment, that Dario was hers. Loyal by relationship, by history, by the weight of what he knew and what he'd been paid to protect. She had not verified that assumption independently. That was the error. Say it again, she said. Her voice was flat. The Calder group filing. Dario's voice was thin and too controlled, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this call 4 times before making it. Ronan's people flagged it 6 weeks ago, before Vittorio passed. They found a gap, A 2-day window in the transfer sequencing where the beneficial ownership structure is arguably ambiguous. Frost has been sitting on it, waiting for the right moment. Celestine said nothing. She was doing the math. Celestine, his voice dropped. The gap is real. I helped build that structure. I know where it is. Frost will use it to argue that the Calder transfers were executed under undue influence, that Vittorio was not of sound mind when he authorized the restructuring. My father was completely lucid until 10 days before he died. I know that. There's documentation of that, medical, witnessed. I know that too. A pause that lasted too long. But documentation can be contested, and Frost is very good at contests. She turned away from the window. The study was dark except for the desk lamp, and its light cast everything in the warm amber of a room that belonged to a dead man. She stood in the middle of it and breathed evenly and thought. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Silence. The particular silence of a man deciding how honest to be. "Because Ronan asked me to tell you," Dario said, as a gesture. "He wants you to know he has this. He wants you to come to Thursday's meeting already, knowing you're not holding every card you think you're holding." She processed this carefully. "He's using you as a messenger. He's been using me as a lot of things." Another pause, and this time something different was underneath it. Something that sounded, improbably, like shame. "For 4 months." The room was very quiet. 4 months, she repeated. "He came to me in July. Said he needed an independent assessment of the network. Said it was routine. That Vittorio had authorized it. I had no reason—" He stopped. "I had reasons to doubt it, and I didn't push hard enough on them. I want you to know that I understand what that means." She moved to the desk and sat down. She pressed her free hand flat on the surface of it, the solid, cool wood of her father's desk, and she grounded herself in the physical reality of the room because the alternative was to let the anger out, and anger, right now, was a resource she couldn't afford to spend carelessly. "What did you give him?" she asked. "Structural maps, the layering of the offshore vehicles, the sequencing timelines of the trust transfers." He exhaled. "Not account numbers, not access credentials, but the architecture, the shape of how things connect. Enough for Frost to build an argument." "Enough for Frost to build an argument," he confirmed quietly. She sat with that for a moment. The Calder group gap was real. She was already running through the instrument in her memory, the 2-day window he was describing, the sequencing irregularity that had come up briefly during the construction phase and been noted and filed and not, she now realized, fully resolved before her father's condition had declined past the point of detailed review. It was small. It was the kind of thing that a judge, looking at the totality of a clean and comprehensive restructuring, would likely dismiss. But Frost was not going to take it to a judge first. Frost was going to use it in that conference room on Thursday as a crowbar. Something to wedge into the conversation, to shift the psychological balance, to make Celestine believe she was arriving at a negotiation rather than a presentation of facts. Ronan's strategy was becoming clear to her. He didn't expect to win a legal challenge to the full restructuring. He expected to create enough uncertainty, enough apparent contestability, that Celestine would agree to a settlement. Give him something. A portion of the Calder assets, maybe. Access to one of the shipping routes. A face-saving exit that let him walk away with enough to rebuild. He was still negotiating. He didn't understand yet that there was nothing to negotiate. "Dario," she said. "Yes." "Are you still working for him?" A long pause. "I'm calling you at midnight the night of your father's funeral," he said. "Does that answer the question?" "It answers one question, not the one I asked." Another silence. She waited. "I stopped working for him when I understood what he actually intended," Dario said finally. "That happened about 3 weeks ago. When I saw what he was planning to do with the DeLuca merger, what he intended to strip from the Varelli structure and hand over to Marco DeLuca as collateral." His voice had gone rougher. "Vittorio brought me into this family 20 years ago when I had nothing. I owed him a decision I should have made in July. I'm making it now. It was not a clean redemption." She was not interested in clean redemptions. They were generally fictions people constructed to make themselves feel better about decisions made too late. But it was something, and more importantly, it was actionable. "The Calder gap," she said. "Can it be closed before Thursday?" "That's why I'm calling." a slight change in his voice, something steadier entering it, the voice of a man who has been waiting to be useful. There's a supplemental instrument that was drafted during the original restructuring. Your father's attorney, Adeeze's office, prepared it as a contingency. It was never executed because the gap was deemed minor. A pause. If you execute it tonight, notarize it with the emergency notary service your father kept on retainer, and file it in the Cayman registry before 8 a.m., the gap closes. The sequence becomes clean. She had already picked up her other phone. Adeeze's emergency line. She's expecting your call. I called her 20 minutes ago. Celestine stopped. You called my attorney before you called me. I wanted to make sure the solution was viable before I presented the problem. His voice was careful. I thought that was what you'd want. She thought about that for exactly 2 seconds. It was, in fact, exactly what she would have wanted, which meant that either Dario Set was genuinely realigning or he was very good at understanding what she needed to hear. Both possibilities required the same response. Use what was useful. Verify everything. Trust nothing, absolutely. All right, she said. I'll make the call. Celestine. His voice stopped her before she ended the call. He's going to come at you hard on Thursday, not just legally. He's going to make it personal. He thinks that's where you're soft. She looked at the desk, at the cedar and old paper and the amber light, at the chair where her father had sat for 40 years and built a world out of silence and strategy. Tell me something I don't know, she said. She ended the call and immediately dialed Adeeze. The next 4 hours were not dramatic. They were the opposite of dramatic. They were the grinding, detailed, unglamorous work of closing a 2-centimeter gap in a 3,000-page legal architecture. Adeeze walked her through the supplemental instrument line by line. The emergency notary, a man named George who sounded genuinely unruffled by being called at 1 in the morning, which suggested this was not the first time, arrived at the townhouse at 1:45. The filing was transmitted at 3:17. Confirmation came back from the Cayman registry at 4:52. Celestine sat at the desk and watched the confirmation come through on the screen and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched. She did not sleep. At 7, she showered and changed and ate half a piece of toast standing at the kitchen counter and thought about what Dario had said. He thinks that's where you're soft. The arrogance of that assumption was almost interesting. 7 years. Ronan had shared a bed and a table and a life with her for 7 years. And what he had concluded about her psychology was that grief was a weakness he could exploit. He had watched her love her father and assumed that love translated into vulnerability. He had mistaken emotional depth for emotional instability. He had confused the fact that she felt things, really felt them, beneath the sovereign's face, with the idea that her feelings could be weaponized against her. He didn't know her. He had never known her. He had known the edited version she presented, and he had seen what he needed to see in that version, and he had never once asked a deeper question. That was his fundamental failure, and it was going to cost him everything. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, the sky flat and low, the kind of weather that made Manhattan feel like a machine rather than a city. Celestine was in the car by 8:15. Adeeze's office was on the 31st floor of a building on West 52nd, clean lines and deliberately quiet interiors, the kind of space designed to feel authoritative without being theatrical. Ronan arrived with Frost and 2 junior attorneys at 9:03, 4 minutes late, which was either accidental or a dominance calculation. She decided it was the latter when she saw the way he walked in. Coat still on for the first 30 seconds, a small performance of unhurriedness. Frost was 64, silver-haired, and had the particular energy of a man who had spent decades being the most competent person in rooms. He moved efficiently. He set his briefcase down. He smiled at Adeeze with professional courtesy. He looked at Celestine with something more careful. The look of a man taking a measurement. Ronan looked at her differently. She saw it immediately. The specific way he had learned to look at her. The combination of assessment and something older. Something that might once have been genuine and had curdled over time into its own kind of possessiveness. Like she was still his, even now. Like the divorce he'd already drafted in his head was something he was doing to her rather than something she had, in every meaningful sense, already done to him. Celestine, he said. Same tone as Tuesday at the cathedral. Managed, controlled. Ronan. She gestured toward the chairs across the long table. Sit down. He didn't like that. The small flicker across his face, there and gone, told her he had expected to be the one directing traffic in this room. He sat. Adayez opened the proceedings with the calm, unhurried efficiency of someone who had no reason to be anxious. She laid out the basic structure, the nature of the Varelli estate, the trust instruments, the pre-existing legal frameworks, the timeline of the restructuring. She spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, and at no point raised her voice. Frost waited. He was patient. She gave him that. When Adayeze finished, Frost opened his briefcase and removed a document, 30, maybe 35 pages, and slid it across the table. We have concerns, he said, about the integrity of several of the trust transfers executed in the final months of Vittorio Varelli's life. Specifically, we've identified a structural ambiguity in the Calder Group beneficial ownership transfer that suggests the Calder transfer is clean, Adayeze said. Not loudly, just absolutely. Frost paused. I have documentation indicating a 2-day sequencing irregularity in the supplemental instrument closing that irregularity was executed, notarized, and filed in the Cayman registry at 3:17 this morning. Adayeze slid her own document across the table. 1 page. Clean. Confirmation attached. The silence in the room was very specific. It had weight and texture. Celestine watched Frost look at the document. She watched him read it twice. She watched the small, controlled recalibration happen behind his eyes. The adjustment of a professional encountering an obstacle. He was prepared for this obstacle only in theory. She watched Ronan watch Frost, and she watched the first crack appear. It was small, a tightening around the jaw, a slight forward shift in his posture, the unconscious lean of a man whose ground has shifted under him. He looked at the document, and then he looked up and he looked at her, and for the first time since the cathedral, she saw something real in his face. Not guilt? Not yet. Something simpler and more animal than guilt. Fear. She held his eyes. She gave him nothing. The Calder instrument was available for review months ago, Adayeze continued, turning pages. As was the full suite of restructuring documents, all of which reflect decisions made and authorized by Vittorio Varelli during a period of verified and documented legal competency. We have medical affidavits from 3 independent physicians, witnessed and notarized, covering a period from 14 months to 10 days prior to Mr. Varelli's death. Any challenge on grounds of incapacity will need to contend with that documentation in its entirety. Frost was still reading. His junior attorneys were very still. Ronan's jaw was working slightly, a muscle in it, just below the ear. She had seen that before, in arguments, in moments when things were not going the way he'd mapped them, when the gap between his plan and reality was wider than he'd calculated. We also have, Adayeze said, documentation of an approach made to one Dario Sette in July of this year, in which Mr. Valieri requested and received a structural mapping of Varelli network assets. That request was made without authorization from Vittorio Varelli and without the knowledge of anyone holding a fiduciary interest in those assets. We are not raising this today as a primary matter. She looked up briefly, precisely. We're raising it to establish context. Ronan's hand, flat on the table, pressed down fractionally harder. She could see the tendons in it. Frost set his document down and looked at Adayeze. What exactly is being proposed here? Nothing is being proposed, Adayeze said. This is an informational meeting. We're informing your clients of the current state of the Varelli estate and the legal structure governing its disposition. There are no assets in dispute because no assets exist outside the established trust structure. There is no estate available for marital claim because the instruments predate the marriage in several cases, and in the remaining cases were established in jurisdictions that don't recognize marital interest in separately held trust assets. She set her pen down. In practical terms, there is nothing here for your client to contest. The room was quiet. Ronan looked at Celestine. Really looked at her. Past the managed expression, past the conference room formality, with something raw and disbelieving opening behind his eyes. Like a man staring at a locked door he was absolutely certain he had the key to, and only now understanding the key was never real. You knew, he said, not to Adeze, to her. She held his gaze. Yes, before he died. Long before he died. He stared at her. The muscle in his jaw was working steadily now. How long? 14 months, she said. Something moved through his face that she couldn't entirely categorize. Too complex to be simple anger, too volatile to be mere humiliation. It was the particular expression of a man whose entire architecture of self had just been handed back to him as a blueprint for something that was never built. You let me... He stopped. Yes, she said. Frost put a hand on Ronan's arm. Subtle, professional, a lawyer's restraint. Ronan didn't shake it off, but his eyes didn't leave Celestine's face. This meeting is premature, Frost said quietly to his client. This meeting is over, Adeze said pleasantly. Frost began gathering his documents. The junior attorneys moved. Ronan didn't move. He sat in his chair and looked at his wife, and the thing happening in his face was not calculation anymore. It was something raw and more fundamental, the look of a man watching the story he'd been telling himself collapse in real time. I want to talk to her, he said to Frost. Alone. Frost started to object. Alone, Ronan said again. Flat. Adeze looked at Celestine. Celestine gave her a barely perceptible nod. Adeze stood, gathered her own files, and walked to the door with the two junior attorneys. She paused at the threshold. 10 minutes, she said. Not to Ronan. The door closed. Ronan and Celestine sat across the long table from each other in the quiet of the conference room, the gray light coming through the windows, the city working its relentless machinery 40 floors below. He looked terrible. She registered this without satisfaction, the particular way a man looks when the body catches up to what the mind is just beginning to process. His face was tight, and his eyes had gone dark, and he looked, she thought, genuinely hollowed out. Why didn't you just leave? He asked. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the management. You didn't give me the option, she said. You were already negotiating with the DeLucas before I knew the full extent of it. If I'd left, there would have been a legal contest. You'd have had Frost and the DeLuca money, and you'd have been in litigation for 3 years trying to pull apart what my father built. She paused. This was cleaner. Cleaner. He looked at the table. 14 months. Yes. While you sat across from me at dinner, while you... He stopped himself. A hand moved across his face. Did you feel anything? During any of it? The question landed differently than she expected. She had prepared for anger, for threats, for negotiation. She had not entirely prepared for the particular quality of this question, the stripped-down, almost desperate humanness of it. She thought about answering it honestly. She decided that she owed him the truth in this one specific thing, even here, even now. I felt everything, she said. I just didn't let it make my decisions. He looked at her for a long moment. The penthouse code, he said. It came out very flat. Changed Tuesday night. He absorbed that. The cars. Transferred Wednesday. The operating accounts. Frozen as of this morning. Each confirmation landed like a door closing. She watched his face as he ran the inventory, the architecture of a life he had built on borrowed ground, and heard each door shut. His breathing had changed. It was careful now. Deliberate. The breathing of a man keeping himself together through pure mechanics, because the alternative was something he couldn't afford to let happen in this room. Viviana, he said. It came out differently from the other words. Harder. Like he was testing whether it would provoke her. Viviana called me Tuesday night, Celestine said. She wanted me to know she had no involvement in your business arrangements. Something crossed his face. You talked to her. Briefly. What did she... He stopped. His jaw tightened again. She's going to leave me. It wasn't a question. It was a man doing his own math in real time, running the numbers on a situation that was revealing itself to be far simpler and far more brutal than he'd imagined. Without the resources he'd promised her, without the empire he'd been delivering her as a courtship gift, without the merger that would have joined 2 criminal dynasties and made him untouchable. Without all of that, what exactly had he offered Viviana DeLuca? Ronan, Celestine said. He looked at her. You have a child coming, she said. Whatever you think of me, whatever this has been. She held his gaze. That child is real. He stared at her. For a moment, something broke through the surface. Something that was neither the charming ambition nor the cold calculation, but something older and more unformed. Something that might have been the man underneath both of those things. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then his phone buzzed on the table between them. He looked down at it. She watched his face change. Watched whatever had briefly opened there close again, hard and fast. He picked up the phone and read the screen. Read it again. He set it face down on the table. "My accounts," he said very quietly. "The personal ones. The ones in my name only." She said nothing. Those were mine. Nothing to do with the Varelli structure. The account at First Meridian was used as collateral in the Calder loan arrangement, Adeze had briefed her. The account at Harbor Trust was listed as a secondary instrument in the DeLuca negotiation documents, which makes it subject to— "Those were mine," he said again, and his voice had changed entirely now. The management was gone. The control was gone, and what was left was something unprocessed and ugly. The voice of a man who has just looked down and discovered the floor is not there. "You took everything." "I took back what was never yours," she said. "There's a difference." He stood up, fast. The chair scraped back hard. He was on his feet and his hands were on the table, and he was leaning toward her and his face was very different now. The charcoal suit and the careful presentation entirely abandoned. Something animal and desperate in the set of his jaw and the darkness around his eyes. "I will burn every piece of this to the ground," he said. Very quiet. Very even. "I will spend every dollar I can find and every year I have left, and I will contest every single instrument your father built until there is nothing left of the Varelli name but— Ronan." Her voice was so quiet and so still that he stopped mid-sentence. She looked up at him from her chair. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She held his eyes across the table, and she let the silence do the work her father had taught her silence always did, when you used it right. "Sit down," she said, "or leave. Those are your options." He stared at her. His phone buzzed again. He didn't look at it. The thing in his face moved through several versions of itself. The anger, the calculation, the desperation, the particular helpless fury of a man who has run out of moves in a game he didn't realize until too late he was losing. And then something collapsed behind his eyes. Not surrender exactly. Something more fundamental than surrender. The failure of the story. He picked up his phone from the table without looking at her. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle, his back to her. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked. The question came out stripped of everything. Just a man in a charcoal suit at a door, asking a question he'd never thought he would have to ask. She looked at his back. "I genuinely don't know," she said. And it was true. He opened the door and walked out. She sat in the empty conference room for a moment, listening to the sound of the city below. The mechanical, indifferent hum of a million decisions being made by a million people who had nothing to do with any of this. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then Adeze came back in and set a phone on the table in front of her, and her face held something tight and careful that Celestine recognized immediately as controlled alarm. "Dario Set was in a car accident 40 minutes ago," Adeze said. "He's alive, but his office was accessed this morning at 6:47, before he left the house." She paused. "Someone pulled his physical files, the hard copies of the supplemental Calder instrument, the ones he kept as backup." Celestine looked at the phone. "The filing is registered," Adeze said. "The digital record is secure. Whatever they took from Dario's office can't undo that." A pause. "But the fact that they tried means someone moved very fast. Someone who knew about the filing within an hour of when we made it." The room was very quiet. Celestine picked up the phone. "Was the accident an accident?" Adeze held her eyes. "The police are calling it one." "That's not what I asked." A long pause. "No," Adeze said. "I don't think it was." Celestine set the phone back down on the table. She looked at the gray light coming through the windows. She thought about what Dario had said on the phone the night before. He's going to come at you hard on Thursday, not just legally. She had understood that to mean psychological pressure, personal provocation, the weaponizing of grief. She had not understood it to mean this. Someone had moved against Dario Sette within an hour of the filing, which meant someone had been watching the process in real time, which meant the information pipeline out of the Virelli network ran deeper and faster than Dario's 4-month detour, which meant there was another layer she hadn't found yet, which meant Ronan Valieri, walking out of this conference room right now with nothing but a phone and a rage he hadn't finished processing, was not operating alone. She stood up. "Find out who accessed Dario's office," she said, "and find out who Ronan has been talking to in the last 72 hours that isn't Frost." She picked up her coat. "Not business contacts, personal ones." She paused. "Start with Marco DeLuca." The car accident was 3 blocks from Dario's apartment on West 81st. Celestine stood on the sidewalk outside Adeyeze's building and looked at the sky and did the math she didn't want to do. The filing had gone through at 3:17. Dario's office had been accessed at 6:47. The accident happened at 7:22. That was a 4-hour window from the moment the supplemental instrument closed the Calder gap to the moment someone drove a car into Dario Set's driver's side door at an intersection that had a working traffic light. 4 hours was not a coincidence. 4 hours was a schedule. Marcus pulled up to the curb and she got in without speaking. He looked at her face in the rear view and didn't ask questions, which was one of the things she valued most about him. He pulled into traffic and she sat in the back seat and thought about Marco DeLuca. Marco DeLuca was 67 years old, and he ran the Eastern Seaboard's most sophisticated narcotics distribution network out of a legitimate shipping company headquartered in Baltimore. He was not a man who acted impulsively. He was not a man who moved without purpose. If Ronan had been negotiating with the DeLuca family for a merger, business and otherwise, as her father had described it, then Marco DeLuca had been conducting his own due diligence on the Virelli assets for months. He would have his own attorneys, his own financial analysts, his own people inside whatever networks he could access. And if Ronan had given him Dario's structural maps, she stopped that thought and rebuilt it more carefully. If Ronan had given Marco DeLuca access to Dario's structural analysis of the Virelli network, then Marco DeLuca had not been waiting for Thursday's conference room meeting to understand what was at stake. He had been running his own parallel process, his own evaluation of what the Virelli assets were worth, what was accessible, what could be contested, what could be taken by other means if the legal route closed. The accident was not a warning to her. She understood that now. The accident was Marco DeLuca closing a leak. Dario had called her at midnight. Dario had called Adeyeze 20 minutes before that. And sometime between 11:40 and midnight, someone monitoring Dario's communications had flagged those calls and sent a report up the chain to a man in Baltimore who did not tolerate leaks. She pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed. "Marcus," she said. "Yes." "How many people inside our current network have had direct contact with anyone in the DeLuca organization in the last 6 months? He was quiet for a moment. "I'd have to run it. Run it now, while you drive." He made a call on the car's system. She listened to him speak in the clipped, efficient shorthand he used with his team. 3 sentences, a request for a specific kind of audit, a 2-hour deadline. When he ended the call, she looked out the window at the city moving past. She was missing something. She could feel it the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue, the shape of an absence, the outline of a thing not yet named. Her phone rang. Adeyeze. "Dario's awake," Adeyeze said. "He has a broken collarbone and a concussion. The car that hit him was stolen from a parking garage in Queens yesterday afternoon." "No connection to DeLuca?" "The plates were pulled from a scrapped vehicle. It's clean on the surface." A pause. His assistant, the woman who worked in his office, was not in the office this morning. She called in sick at 6:15. Celestine was quiet. "Her name is Petra Voss," Adeyeze said. "She's been with Dario for 4 years. I'm running her. Run her against the DeLuca network first, then run her against anyone connected to Ronan directly. Already doing it." Another pause, and this one had a different quality. The pause of a person deciding how to deliver something. "There's something else." Celestine waited. "Ronan filed for divorce this morning," Adeyeze said. 40 minutes after he left our conference room. Frost submitted it electronically. The grounds are irreconcilable differences, which is standard, but attached to the filing is a petition for emergency injunctive relief to prevent the dispersal or transfer of any additional Virelli assets pending the outcome of the marital proceedings. A beat. "It's a Hail Mary," The instrument grounds are thin, but it will take a judge 24 to 48 hours to review and dismiss it. And during that window, technically, we're constrained. Bo Martin. He's buying time. He's buying time, Adeze confirmed. And he filed in New York State Court, not federal, which means the timeline for dismissal is domestic and slower. She paused. Someone advised him to do that. Frost would have known it was futile. This came from somewhere else. Celestine's husband tightened around the phone. DeLuca has a New York attorney, someone who knows the state court timing. That's what I think, Adeze said quietly. She ended the call and sat with the weight of the morning pressing down on her, and thought about the shape of what was being built against her. It was not Ronan's strategy. Ronan was capable, and he was dangerous, and he had spent 7 years learning to move inside the Varelli network, but he was not this precise. This layered, the accident, the filing, the 48-hour window created by the injunction, these were coordinated moves, executed within a 90-minute window after he left the conference room. Ronan didn't have the operational infrastructure to execute that kind of coordination from a standing start. Marco DeLuca had been ready. Marco DeLuca had been ready before Thursday morning. He had contingency plans for the conference room going well, and contingency plans for it going badly, and the version where it went badly, the version where Celestine walked out of that conference room with the structure intact and Ronan walking out with nothing. That was the version Marco DeLuca had been preparing for longest. The question she needed to answer, and needed to answer before anything else, was how deep Marco's preparation ran. Because if he had people inside the Varelli network, not Dario, who had already declared himself, but others, people she had not identified, people who were still in position, then every move she made in the next 48 hours would be visible to him in real time. She needed to think. And she needed to think somewhere that wasn't moving and wasn't her phone and wasn't the accumulated pressure of a morning that had already been 3 days long. The townhouse, she told Marcus. He changed lanes without comment. She was in the study on the 4th floor by 11, the door closed, the room quiet. She stood in the middle of it for a moment and looked at her father's desk and thought about something he had told her once, years ago, when she was perhaps 19, and had asked him what he did when he realized he had underestimated someone. He had looked at her for a long time before answering. Then he said, "You stop trying to recover the position you've lost. You build a new position from where you actually are. Men who spend their energy grieving lost ground never take new ground. Accept the loss. Move forward." She sat down at the desk. She pulled up the Varelli network diagram on the encrypted system. The full structural map, every instrument, every vehicle, every connection. The same map that Dario had handed to Ronan in July. Which meant it was the same map Marco DeLuca had been looking at for 4 months. He knew the shape of her empire, which meant she needed to change the shape. She was 3 pages into a restructuring analysis when the call came in from a number she didn't recognize. Different number from last night, different area code, but she recognized the rhythm of it, the particular timing. It rang once, stopped, rang twice more. Her father's old signal, the one he used with people so deep inside the network that even coded language was too exposed. She stared at the phone. Her father was dead. No one should be using that signal. She picked up. "Who is this?" she said. A man's voice. Old, careful. "You don't know me. Your father did." A pause. "My name is not important. What's important is that I have been watching the events of the last 72 hours, and I need you to understand something before you take another step." "How did you get this number?" "Your father gave it to me 2 years ago. He said if he ever died and the network came under pressure from an unexpected direction, I should use it once." A pause. "This is once." She was quiet. She was thinking about the signal, the prearranged pattern. Her father had layers she had never fully mapped. She had known that, had accepted it, had told herself she would discover them in time. This was one she had not found. "Talk," she said. "Marco DeLuca has been inside the Varelli network for longer than your husband," the voice said. "Not through Dario, through someone further up." A pause that had weight to it. "Through someone your father trusted completely and who turned 18 months ago." She felt the sentence land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went out and out. "Give me a name," she said. Her voice was very steady. "Before I do," the man said, "I need you to understand what this means. This is not a peripheral contact. This is not an attorney or an accountant. This is someone inside the operational core, someone who knew the restructuring timeline, who knew the trust instruments, who knew the details of your father's final 14 months. Another pause. Someone who was in the room. She pressed her free hand flat on the desk, felt the wood, stayed in the room. "Give me the name," she said again, a long breath on the line. Then, "Marcus Hale." The room didn't move. The city didn't stop. The amber light from the desk lamp continued its indifferent work across the surface of her father's desk. Everything was exactly as it had been 3 seconds ago. But something inside her chest had gone very cold. Marcus, who had served her father for 30 years, who had stood beside her at the top of the cathedral steps and told her Ronan's car was 4 minutes out, who had changed the penthouse code on her instruction, who had been in the car with her all morning, who had made the call for the network audit, who had driven her home and was right now downstairs in the townhouse. Who knew she had filed the supplemental Calder instrument at 3:17 this morning? She didn't move. She kept her breathing even. She kept her face exactly as it was, though there was no one in the room to see it. "Documentation," she said, "being sent to Adayeze Okafor's office now, encrypted. She has the key." A pause. "I'm sorry. He was your father's man a long time before he was DeLuca's. I don't know when it changed. I'm not sure even he knows exactly when it changed, but it changed." The line went dead. She set the phone down on the desk and sat very still. She thought about the 4 hours between the Calder filing and Dario's accident. Marcus had been in the car with her for most of that morning. He had made a call on the car system. She had heard it, had registered it as routine, as him running the network audit she'd requested. She had not thought to question the content because she had not yet had reason to question the source. She thought about the network audit he'd requested. She had asked him to identify DeLuca contacts inside the Varelli network. He had called his team and initiated the search. He had initiated a search for himself. She sat with that for a moment. The absolute cold efficiency of it. A man asked to find a leak. Who was the leak? Running a process he controlled entirely. By the time that audit came back, it would show what Marcus wanted it to show. It would be clean. And she would have spent 24 hours operating on the assumption that she was looking for something he had already hidden. She thought about what else he knew. He knew the supplemental instrument. He knew the Calder filing timeline. He knew the conference room meeting had gone badly for Ronan. He would have been updated within minutes. He knew that she had told Adayeze to investigate Marco DeLuca and Ronan's personal contacts. He knew she was in this study right now. He was downstairs. Her hand moved toward the phone, stopped. Calling Adayeze would be visible. Marcus had access to the household security system, which included a monitoring overlay that logged outgoing communications from the townhouse network. If she called from this phone on this system, he would see it. She looked at the desk. In the center drawer beneath the second layer of files, her father kept a secondary phone. A separate number, separate network, used for communications he needed completely isolated from the operational system. She had found it during the weeks after his death when she went through every drawer in this room. She had charged it and kept it in the drawer and told no one about it, not even Marcus. She opened the drawer. The phone was there. She turned it on. It had 60% battery and a signal. She dialed Adayez from memory. Adayez picked up on the second ring. "Don't say my name," Celestine said quietly. "Listen, the encrypted package coming to your office in the next few minutes, open it immediately. Read it before you talk to anyone. Call me back on this number." She read the number from the screen. "Not my regular line. This one only." A pause. "Understood," Adayeze said. She ended the call. She sat very still and listened to the townhouse around her, the particular silence of a large building that always had low-grade sounds beneath the quiet. The ventilation system, the creak of the old floors, somewhere 2 levels below, the faint movement of a person in the space. Marcus. She thought about 30 years, the weight of 30 years of service, of dinners where he stood at the edge of the room, of international travel where he positioned himself between her father and every possible threat, of the specific intimacy of a security relationship that is closer than friendship and more conditional than love. Her father had trusted him with everything, had trusted him with her. She thought about what the voice on the phone had said. I don't know when it changed. I'm not sure even he knows exactly when it changed. That sentence bothered her more than the betrayal itself, because it described something she understood: the gradual erosion of a fixed position under sustained pressure. Marco DeLuca did not recruit through ideology. He recruited through debt, through leverage, through the slow accumulation of small compromises that eventually became too heavy to carry back. Someone had found a crack in Marcus 18 months ago and had worked it patiently for a year and a half until the crack was a door. She wanted to know what the crack was, not because it changed what she needed to do, but because it was information. Everything was information. The secondary phone buzzed. Adeyeze. I have it, Adeyeze said. Her voice was different, tighter, with something underneath it that sounded like controlled shock. It's thorough. Bank records, communication logs, 3 documented meetings with a DeLuca intermediary in a parking garage in Hoboken over the last 6 months. A pause. Celestine. He was in the room when your father finalized the last 3 trust instruments. He witnessed 2 of them. I know. If DeLuca has those witness records, if he can demonstrate that Marcus had access to the execution timeline, he can build an argument that the instruments were not independently witnessed, Celestine said quietly, that the witness had a conflict of interest, that the transfer process was compromised. She pressed her free hand against her forehead. It doesn't invalidate the instruments, but it gives Frost another angle, another contestable point. It gives them a narrative, Adeyeze said, that the entire restructuring was orchestrated under compromised conditions, that even the people certifying its integrity were conflicted. A pause. It's not a winning argument, but it's a headline. It's the kind of thing that makes a judge take a second look, the kind of thing that creates delay. Delay. There was the word. Not destruction. DeLuca was too careful to try outright destruction, because outright destruction of a legal structure this clean would require a level of judicial interference that carried its own risks. What he wanted was delay. Injunctions, contestable instruments, clouded witness records, an ongoing litigation that consumed resources and attention and created windows during which DeLuca could negotiate, acquire, position. Windows during which Ronan, desperate and cooperating, could be useful. Windows during which the Varelli network, distracted and defending, might leave a door open somewhere. It was a brilliant strategy. She could see all of it now, the whole shape of it, the way you see the picture in a puzzle only when the last few pieces are in place. The problem was that seeing the shape was not the same as having a counter. I need to deal with Marcus, she said. How? Adeyeze asked carefully. I don't know yet. She was honest about that. But I can't have him in this building with access to this system while I figure out the next move. A pause. And I can't let him know I know. If he goes back to DeLuca and reports that his cover is blown, DeLuca accelerates. Whatever he has planned that he hasn't deployed yet, he deploys it. So you need him contained without being tipped. Yes. Silence on the line. Then Adeyeze said, There's something else in the package. Something I don't fully understand yet, but that you should know. Celestine waited. There's a document, a private agreement drafted 4 months ago between Ronan Valieri and Marco DeLuca. Standard merger language on the surface. But buried in the annexure, there's a clause. Adeyeze's voice went careful. It designates Viviana DeLuca's unborn child as the primary beneficiary of a structured inheritance instrument, one that draws from Varelli origin assets. A pause. Celestine. They weren't planning a business merger, they were planning a dynasty. The child is the mechanism. If Ronan could establish legitimate claim to any portion of the Varelli estate, even a small portion, and assign it to a trust in the child's name, with DeLuca as co-trustee, the DeLuca family would have a legal foothold inside Varelli assets that would survive Ronan entirely. The room was absolutely still. She sat in her father's chair in her father's study and felt, for the first time since this began, something that was not controlled anger or managed grief or strategic calculation. She felt something older and colder than any of those things. The particular sensation of understanding, completely and finally, the true dimensions of what had been built against her. This was never about Ronan's ego. Ronan was a vehicle, an access point, a man with proximity to the Varelli family who had been identified, cultivated, and steered, possibly for years before she had identified his betrayal, by a man in Baltimore who thought in generations. Her father had known about Ronan. He had not known about Marco De Luca's full involvement. She was certain of that now, because if Vittorio had known, he would have told her. He had been meticulous about what he left her. He would not have left that out. Which meant her father, brilliant and thorough in dying, had built a fortress against the wrong enemy. She stood up. She walked to the window, looked at the city, breathed. Her father had built the fortress against Ronan, against a greedy husband with ambition beyond his station, against a predictable betrayal by a predictable kind of man. He had built it well, and he had built it completely, and it was, against Ronan Valieri alone, entirely sufficient. But Ronan was not alone. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass for exactly 3 seconds. Then she straightened. She turned back to the room. The document package sitting in Adiese's office was a weapon. The question was whether she could deploy it before De Luca understood that she had it, before Marcus, downstairs, received some signal that the situation had shifted and made a call to a number in Baltimore. She looked at the secondary phone in her hand. She thought about timing. She thought about what she knew, what De Luca knew, what Marcus knew, and the gap between those 3 sets of information. The gap was narrow, maybe hours, maybe less. She thought about her father's voice. Accept the loss. Build a new position from where you actually are. She was not in the position she thought she was in this morning. The position she thought she was in this morning was a fortress with a man inside it who had a key to every room. She needed to build from here, from this room, from this phone, from what she actually had. She opened the door of the study and walked to the top of the stairs and looked down into the quiet hallway below. "Marcus," she called. Her voice was entirely normal, warm, even, the voice of a woman who had just had a difficult morning and needed her most trusted person. She heard him move in the room below, the sound of a chair. Footsteps. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at her, and his face was the face she had known her entire life, steady, capable, entirely composed. And she looked at it and felt the particular grief of discovering that something you have known forever was never entirely what you thought it was. "Come up," she said. "I need to talk through the next steps." He started up the stairs. And as he climbed toward her, she stood at the top and held the secondary phone behind her back and thought, "I have one move. It has to be the right one. And I have to make it before he reaches the top of these stairs and sees my face clearly enough to read what..." She had 4 seconds before he reached the top of the stairs. She used them. The secondary phone was already open to Adiese's number. She typed 3 words in the message field, "Execute the package," and sent it before Marcus's hand touched the landing railing. Then she slid the phone into her jacket pocket and arranged her face into the expression her father had spent 20 years teaching her, the sovereign's face, the one that gave nothing. Marcus reached the top of the stairs and looked at her. He was 61 years old, and he was built for exactly this kind of moment, the kind where everything depended on reading a room correctly in the first 3 seconds. She watched his eyes move across her face with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades doing threat assessments on human beings before they knew they were being assessed. She held completely still. "Come in," she said, and stepped back from the doorway. He walked into the study. He moved the way he always moved, controlled, deliberate, taking up exactly the space required and no more. He looked at the desk, at the monitors, at the room's ordinary details, and she watched him do it and understood that he was doing his own calculation, checking whether anything had changed since she'd been alone up here. Whether the room told him something her face was hiding. The desk was exactly as it had been. The monitors were dark. The secondary phone was in her pocket and not visible. He looked at her. "You wanted to talk through next steps." "Sit down," she said. He sat in the chair across from the desk, the visitor's chair, the one her father's attorneys had used and his associates, and once, a man from Interpol who had come with questions that never went anywhere. She sat behind the desk. Her father's position. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked at Marcus Hale across 30 years of her life and felt the cold place in her chest that had been there since the phone call and let it do what cold places did, make her precise. "Tell me about Hoboken," she said. The room didn't change. The light didn't change. Marcus didn't move, but something happened in his face, not a flinch, not a tell, something more fundamental than either of those. The slight, involuntary suspension of breath that a body produces when the ground drops away under it. It lasted less than a second, and then it was gone, and he was looking at her with the same steady, capable composure he had shown her every day of her life. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "3 meetings," she said. "Parking garage on Observer Highway. November, January, March. A man named Theo Parisi, who works logistics for the DeLuca distribution network." She kept her voice entirely even. "You paid for parking on your personal card each time. Small mistake. My father always said the small mistakes were the ones that mattered." He looked at her. His jaw was set. His hands were on his knees, flat and still. "When?" he said. Just that one word. "About 40 minutes ago." Something moved through his eyes. The specific movement of a person calculating what 40 minutes meant, what had been done in 40 minutes, whether the window was open or closed. She watched him run the numbers and watched him arrive at the answer. "Areeze," he said. Among others, he breathed in through his nose. Out. Once. The breath of a man closing a door inside himself, shutting down the options one by one until only the truth was left in the room. She had seen her father do it with people. She had never expected to see it in Marcus. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Enough," she said. "I want to hear the rest from you." He looked at the window. The gray light was flat and indifferent. His profile was the same profile she had known since she was a child. The strong jaw, the gray at the temples, the particular stillness of a man trained to be the last line of something. Except now the something was wrong. "It started with a debt," he said. His voice had changed. The management was gone. "Not mine. My son's." He paused. "Mateo. He got into the wrong arrangement with the wrong people 4 years ago. By the time I found out, the number was too large. I used everything I had. It wasn't enough." A pause that had weight to it. "Parisi found me 6 months later. He didn't threaten Mateo. He didn't have to. He just explained that the debt was still out there, with a different owner now, and that there were 2 ways it could be resolved." His jaw moved. "I chose the wrong way." She looked at him. She thought about what the voice on the phone had said. "I don't know when it changed. I'm not sure even he knows exactly when it changed." And here was the answer. Not ideology, not ambition, not resentment. A father's panic in the dark. The oldest lever in the world. "What did you give them?" she asked. "The restructuring timeline," he said. "Dates, sequence, jurisdictions, not account numbers, not instrument details, but the shape of it. When things were moving, what was moving, who was signing." He paused. "And the witness records. My own records. Certified copies of the instruments I witnessed." His voice had gone rough at the edges. "They wanted documentation that I had been present, that I had access, that I could be used as a point of contestation." She was very still. "Did my father know?" A long pause. "No." "He trusted you with everything." "Yes." The word came out like something breaking. "I know." She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it. The specific grief of a betrayal that had its origin in love. The wrong love. Misdirected. Executed through the wrong means, but love nonetheless. A father protecting his son. She understood the impulse in her bones. She hated it, and she understood it, and neither of those things changed what it had cost. "Is Mateo safe?" she asked. He looked at her sharply, the first genuine surprise she'd seen from him. "Right now, today." "Is he safe?" she said. "Yes," Marcus said carefully. "The debt was declared resolved 8 months ago. Whatever Parisi told him, the debt was declared resolved because they got what they wanted from you, and they wanted to keep you operable," she said. "Not because they were done with you." She held his eyes. "You understand that?" His jaw worked. He looked at the desk. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand that." "They never planned to let you go," she said. "That's not how Marco DeLuca operates. You were going to be useful until you weren't, and when you weren't useful anymore." She stopped. She didn't need to finish the sentence, and she didn't particularly want to. He knew. She could see it in the way he sat, the particular posture of a man who had been telling himself a story about his situation and had, in the last 3 minutes, run out of story. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the secondary one. She did not take it out. "I need something from you," she said. He looked at her. The composure was still there, but underneath it was something she had never seen in his face before. Something exposed and exhausted, like a wall after a long rain. "What?" he said. "Parisi, when does he expect your next contact?" A pause. "Tonight, 7 o'clock. Status report on the conference room meeting." She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:43 in the morning. She had 7 hours and 17 minutes. "Here's what you're going to tell him," she said. She talked for 6 minutes. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him processing it. The specific calculation of a man being asked to operate in a space where every move carried consequences he couldn't fully see. "If DeLuca finds out I've flipped," he said. "He's going to find out," she said. "That's the point. Then Matteo will be in a car to his sister's place in Portland before you make the call tonight," she said. "I'm going to make that happen in the next 2 hours. DeLuca won't move on him. Not as a punitive measure. Not with everything else that's going to be in motion by this evening. He's going to have much more immediate problems." Marcus stared at her. Something moved through his face that she couldn't entirely read. Something that was partly relief and partly something much more complicated than relief. The expression of a man being offered a hand out of a hole he dug himself. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing this for Matteo?" She held his eyes. "Because my father would have," she said, "and because you were his for 30 years before you were theirs for 18 months. I'm not going to pretend that erases it, but I'm not going to pretend it counts for nothing either." He nodded once. His eyes were very bright. He pressed his mouth into a flat line and nodded again and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. "Go downstairs," she said. "Be exactly who you've been all morning. I need 2 more hours of cover while I move the pieces." He stood. He moved to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. The same spot Ronan had stopped in the conference room this morning, the same angle of a person at a door with something unfinished behind them. "She would have found this eventually," he said. "Your father, he knew," Celestine said. Marcus turned and looked at her. "He found out 8 weeks before he died," she said. "He told me to leave you in place because you were more useful in form than replaced." She held his gaze. "He said you'd come back to yourself when the moment required it." The silence in the room was very specific. "He was right," Marcus said. His voice was barely a sound. He walked out. She listened to his footsteps go down the stairs. Then she took the secondary phone from her pocket. Adaeze had sent 4 messages in the last 12 minutes. The first confirmed receipt, sort of the execute instruction. The second reported that the document package had been delivered simultaneously to 3 separate recipients: the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and a journalist of the Financial Tribune named Cassandra Park, who had been investigating DeLuca's shipping operations for 2 years, and who Celestine's father had quietly been feeding information to for 14 months, positioning exactly this moment. The third message said, "Ronan's injunction dismissed. Judge reviewed on emergency basis. Grounds insufficient." As expected. The fourth message said, "Viviana DeLuca left Ronan's hotel at 9:40 this morning with 2 suitcases. She's not answering his calls." Celestine read all 4 messages. She sat back in the chair. The injunction being dismissed meant the 48-hour window DeLuca had been counting on was gone, collapsed to less than 3 hours. That would be reaching him now, or in the next few minutes. He would adjust. He would move faster. Good. Fast movement left traces. Deliberate, patient movement was invisible. Panic was readable. She had 1 sequence left to execute, and she needed it done before DeLuca understood the full scope of what was coming at him. She made 4 calls in the next 20 minutes. The first was to a man named Henri Voss, no relation to Petra, Dario's compromised assistant, who ran the Varelli network's legitimate financial architecture, and who had been with the family for 11 years, vetted independently, and was not on any list that connected to DeLuca or Ronan. She gave him 3 specific instructions about account structures that needed to move before end of business. The second call was to Cassandra Park directly. Park picked up on the first ring, which told Celestine she had been waiting. "You have everything?" Celestine asked. "I have everything, and I've been sitting on it for 3 weeks waiting for your go," Park said. Her voice had the particular energy of a journalist who has been holding a story so long it's become physical. The DeLuca Valieri merger document, the Hoboken meeting records, the beneficial ownership clause for the child's trust, the Calder gap, and the supplemental instrument timeline. A pause. "This goes live tonight. 11 o'clock edition. Make sure the child's name is not in the piece," Celestine said. "That clause and everything connected to it. Describe it structurally, not personally." A beat of silence. "Understood," Park said. Something in her voice had shifted slightly, a recognition of the line being drawn and the reason for it. "It'll hold the same weight without the name." "It will," Celestine agreed. "Run it." The third call was to a private security contractor named Reeves, who operated out of an office in Red Hook, and who had done work for the Varelli network on 4 occasions over the past decade. She gave him Matteo Hale's address in Astoria, and a Portland address, and a budget. He said he could have the man in a car within 90 minutes. She told him 70 was better. The fourth call was the one she had been putting off. She dialed the number Viviana DeLuca had called from on Tuesday night. It rang 5 times. She was about to end the call when Viviana answered. Her voice was flat and exhausted, with something raw at the edges that sounded like a woman who had been crying and had stopped, not because she was done, but because she had run out. "Where are you?" Celestine asked. A long pause. "Why?" "Because in approximately 4 hours, your father is going to understand that everything he built around Ronan has collapsed," Celestine said. "And when that happens, his first instinct is going to be to secure assets. The child is an asset in his framework. I want to make sure you understand that." Silence on the line, the sound of a breath being held. "What are you saying?" Viviana said, very quietly. "I'm saying that the agreement your father signed with Ronan, the one with the beneficiary clause, is going to be in a newspaper tonight. And when it is, your father is going to move quickly to reposition everything connected to it, including the arrangement." A pause. "You are the arrangement." A long silence. She could hear Viviana breathing. "He wouldn't," Viviana said. But the way she said it, the specific fragility of those 2 words, told Celestine that she was not entirely certain of that. "I don't know what he would or wouldn't do," Celestine said honestly. "I know that men who build their strategies around children tend to become very focused when those strategies come under threat." She paused. "Do you have somewhere to go that isn't connected to your father's network?" A silence so long she almost spoke again. "My mother's sister," Viviana said finally. "In Naples. Can you get there tonight?" Another silence. "Yes." "Then go," Celestine said. "Take nothing that has any connection to your father's finances. Leave the cards he gave you. Leave the phone if it's registered to any of his accounts." She paused. "The child needs a mother who is somewhere safe. Everything else can be dealt with from safe." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. Then she stood up and walked to the window and looked at the city and felt something move through her chest that was not quite any emotion she had a name for. Something compound and exhausting. The specific weight of having moved many pieces across many hours and now standing at the moment before the last sequence began. Her father had built the fortress for the wrong enemy. She had spent the last 4 hours rebuilding it for the right one. The phone rang, not the secondary phone, her regular line, a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Ms. Varelli." A man's voice, older, Baltimore cadence, unhurried in the specific way of a man who had spent 67 years never needing to hurry. "My name is Marco DeLuca." She had never heard his voice before. It was not what she had expected, not hard, not overtly threatening, not the voice of a man performing danger. It was the voice of a man who had simply, for a very long time, been the most consequential person in every room he entered. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. "I understand there's been a busy morning," he said. "I thought it might be useful for us to speak directly." "I thought so too," she said. "I assumed you'd call sooner." A brief pause, just long enough to be acknowledgement. "You've been thorough," he said. "Your father would be satisfied." "My father would have preferred not to need to be," she said. "Perhaps." A pause. I want to be direct with you, Miss Varelli. The agreement I had with your husband was a business arrangement. His failings as a husband are not my concern and were not my instrument. I saw an opportunity in the structure of your family's network, and I pursued it through the available access point. That's commerce. You had a man inside my household for 18 months, she said. You attempted to create a legal mechanism to embed your family into my assets through an unborn child. You put Dario Sete in a hospital this morning. Her voice was completely level. Call it what you need to call it. A silence. The Sete matter was an operational decision made below my direct authorization, he said. The phrasing was precise, deniable. I regret it. No, you don't, she said. But that's fine. Something that might have been amusement moved through his voice. Your father was a man I respected, he said. We were never allies, but I respected his precision. A pause. I find I respect yours as well, which is why I'm calling. To make an offer before tonight becomes something that damages both of our interests. She looked out the window. I'm listening, she said. Not because she was going to accept anything, because she wanted to hear the full shape of what he thought he still had. The newspaper piece, he said. And there it was. He already knew about Cassandra Park, which meant he had a connection either at the Tribune or inside the SDNY filing process. If it runs, it runs. I've weathered investigations before, but the beneficial ownership clause, my daughter's name attached to a contested inheritance instrument, that creates a vulnerability for Viviana that serves neither of us. A pause. I'm asking you to pull it. She thought about Viviana in a hotel room somewhere in this city with 2 suitcases and a flight to Naples to book. Viviana isn't in the piece, she said. Silence. A longer one than before. The child's name is not in the piece, she said. The clause is described structurally. No names, no identification. She paused. I made that decision before you called. The silence this time had a different quality. She had surprised him. She could feel it across the line, the specific compression of a man recalibrating in real time. Why? He asked. Because the child didn't choose any of this, she said, and I'm not my father. I'm not even trying to be. A pause. But everything else runs tonight, Mr. DeLuca. The merger documents, the Hoboken meetings, the beneficial ownership structure, the timeline of your approach to Ronan, all of it. A long, considered silence. That's a declaration, he said quietly. It is, she said. You understand what that means, he said. Not a threat exactly. A man being precise about consequences. Yes, she said. Do you? She could hear him breathing. The slow, even breath of a man who had not been placed in this position in a very long time and was feeling, perhaps for the first time in years, the particular sensation of a room that was not going the way he had prepared it to go. Your father built well, he said finally. He built for the enemy he knew, she said. I built for you. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Marco DeLuca said very softly, Tonight is going to be interesting. And the line went dead. She stood at the window with the phone in her hand and the city below her and the flat gray sky above it, and she thought about what came next. The newspaper running at 11, the SDNY receiving the package, the Hoboken records and the merger documents, and the beneficial ownership clause all entering the permanent, uncontrollable record of the world. And she felt the specific quality of a moment that was about to become irreversible. Not the moment itself, the moment before it. She had 4 hours until the piece ran. In those 4 hours, Marco DeLuca was going to move. She didn't know exactly how, and she didn't know exactly where, but she knew the shape of it. A man of 67 with 67 years of operational infrastructure and a network that ran from Baltimore to 3 continents, and lawyers she hadn't mapped and instruments she hadn't found. And the particular dangerous energy of a person who has just been told, politely and irrevocably, that he is lost. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. A text. 2 words. Parisi just called me. He knows about the package. DeLuca moving on the Harbor Trust accounts. Right now. She read it twice. Harbor Trust. The personal accounts. The ones Adayeze had already secured with the injunction dismissal, the ones that should have been. Her stomach dropped 2 inches. Harbor Trust was not in Adayeze's secured instrument. It was adjacent to it, close enough that she had assumed it was covered, had not independently verified, had moved past it in the 4-hour scramble of the Calder Gap and the Marcus situation and the Viviana call. She was already dialing Adayeze when the second text came from Marcus. He has a trustee inside Harbor Trust. Someone your father never found. They're executing a transfer right now. $340 million in liquid assets. She pressed the phone to her ear. It rang again. Adayeze, she said the moment it connected. Harbor Trust. Tell me we have a block in place. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. Celestine, Adayeze said. And the way she said it, the specific quality of controlled alarm breaking through professional composure, told her everything before the next words. We don't have a block, Adayeze said. Harbor Trust was not in the secured instruments. I'm looking at it right now. The trustee executed a transfer authorization 12 minutes ago, internal signatory. Someone with legacy access from before your father restructured the account in 2019. Celestine was already moving. Out of the study, down the stairs, coat off the hook by the front door. How much has moved, she said. 40 million so far. The full transfer is 340. It's processing in tranches. They're moving it in pieces to avoid the automated flag threshold. 11 tranches of roughly 30 million each. A pause filled with the sound of Adayeze typing. Celestine, if all 11 tranches complete, that money is in a DeLuca shell in the Caymans within the hour, and we are in a 2-year litigation trying to get it back. Stop the 7th tranche, Celestine said. She was outside, on the townhouse steps, the November air hitting her face like a fist. The first 6 are gone. Accept that. But tranche 7 hasn't initiated yet. How do you know? The threshold flag triggers at the 200 million mark, she said. 6 tranches of 30 is 180. They'll pause before the 7th to confirm the flag hasn't been triggered. That pause is our window. She was already moving toward the car. Call the Harbor Trust compliance officer directly, not the trustee, not the branch manager. The compliance officer. Her name is Sandra Reeve. She's been there 11 years. My father knew her. Tell her we have documented evidence of an unauthorized transfer authorization by a conflicted trustee, and we are requesting an emergency compliance hold pending an investigation filing with FinCEN. She pulled the car door open. Tell her the FinCEN filing was already submitted this morning, because it was. A pause. Then Adayeze said with something that sounded like controlled awe, You knew this account was exposed. I suspected it 2 hours ago, Celestine said. I didn't have time to shore it up, and I gambled that DeLuca would move on it too late. She got in the car. I was wrong by about 40 minutes. Work with what we have. On it, Adayeze said. The line stayed open. Celestine could hear her already dialing on a separate line, the efficient dual-channel work of a woman who operated in crises the way other people operated in conference rooms. Marcus was in the driver's seat. He looked at her in the rear view. She met his eyes. Harbor Trust, she said. Drive. He pulled out without a word. The next 19 minutes were the longest of her life, and they were spent almost entirely in silence. She sat in the back seat and listened to Adayeze work on the open line. The call to Sandra Reeve, the explanation delivered in precise, urgent language, the moment of resistance from Reeve's assistant that Adayeze cut through with the FinCEN filing number, the hold music that lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds while Reeve pulled the transfer records, and then Reeve's voice coming back on the line with a quality in it that Celestine recognized from across the car, the voice of a compliance officer who has just seen something in a file that made her stomach drop. I'm flagging the account, Reeve said. Emergency hold. Nothing moves until I've reviewed the authorization chain. How many tranches completed? Adayeze asked. A pause. 6, Reeve said. Tranche 7 was queued. It hasn't initiated. Celestine closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. $180 million was gone. And the Caymans, already dispersed into the labyrinthine shell architecture that DeLuca had spent decades constructing. Gone in the sense that recovering it would take years of international legal coordination, and even then would not be certain. Gone in any practical, immediate sense. $160 million was frozen in a compliance hold at Harbor Trust. She opened her eyes. She had lost $180 million in the last 20 minutes. She had saved 160. The net position was not what she had planned this morning. It was not what she had planned any morning for the last 14 months. But it was workable. She had built a structure worth billions. She had just lost a portion of a portion. DeLuca had moved fast and found a crack she hadn't sealed and taken what the crack allowed. It was a real loss. She was not going to pretend otherwise, not even to herself, not even in the privacy of the back seat of a moving car. She breathed. She accepted it. She moved forward. "Adeze," she said. "Here." The SDNY package, when does it reach the duty attorney? It was delivered at 9 this morning, digital and physical. I spoke to the intake coordinator at 11. They flagged it for review today. "Call them again," she said. "Tell them the transfer activity at Harbor Trust in the last 30 minutes is directly connected to the filing. Give them Sandra Reeves' name and the compliance hold number. Tell them the window is closing." A pause. "I'll make the call." The line went quiet. Marcus drove. The city moved past in the particular gray indifference of a November afternoon in New York, and Celestine looked at it and thought about Marco DeLuca sitting somewhere in Baltimore, or in a car, or in a room she would never see, looking at the same information from the other side, running his own calculation about what 180 million in recovered assets bought him against the cost of what was coming. She thought about what came next with the clarity she had been building toward for 14 months. Not the plan she had made, which had just been partially broken, but the thing underneath the plan. The actual objective. The irreducible thing her father had spent his dying months preparing her to understand. The assets were not the point. They had never been the point. The point was the name. The Varelli name. What it represented, who it reached, what it built or destroyed depending on who carried it. Her father had understood this with a completeness she was only now fully absorbing. He had not spent 14 months protecting money. He had spent 14 months ensuring that when the dust settled, the name was in the right hands. Hands that would use it for something other than what it had been used for. $180 million was real money. It was not the Varelli name. She arrived at Harbor Trust at 12:41. The building was a glass tower on Park Avenue South, clinical and quietly powerful in the way of institutions that have never needed to advertise. Sandra Reeve met her in a conference room on the 14th floor. A compact, careful woman in her mid-50s with the particular manner of someone who has spent decades in rooms where very large sums of money changed hands, and who had learned to carry the weight of that without letting it show. Reeve laid the transfer records on the table without preamble. 6 completed tranches, 1 frozen. The authorization chain for the trustee, a man named Gerald Foss, appointed to the account in 2017, carrying legacy access through an instrument that predated Vittorio's 2019 restructuring and had not been caught in the reconfiguration. Celestine looked at the records. She looked at Gerald Foss's authorization signature 6 times on the completed tranches. She thought about how long he had been in place. 2017, 5 years before any of this, 7 years before today, and felt the particular chill of understanding that some of DeLuca's preparation had begun when she and Ronan were still in what she had believed was a marriage. "The trustee," she said to Reeve. "Where is he now?" "He left the building at 12:09, Reeve said, "shortly after the 6th tranche completed, before my compliance hold." "He was watching the tranches clear in real time," Celestine said. "That's my assessment," Reeve said. Her voice was dry and precise. "I've been doing this for 11 years and I have never seen an authorization chain this clean used for something this deliberate. Whoever set this up, set it up to look entirely routine until the moment it wasn't. Can you testify to that?" Reeve looked at her steadily. "If the SDNY asks me to, yes." "They're going to ask you to," Celestine said. She slid a card across the table, Adea's card. "My attorney will be in contact before end of business." She left the building at 1:50. In the car, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and did nothing, just sat. Marcus didn't start the engine. The street outside ran its ordinary business. Cabs, pedestrians, a delivery truck double parked and hazard flashing, the city in its profound indifferent continuity. "Mateo's in the car," Marcus said. "Reeves picked him up 40 minutes ago." She nodded. "He doesn't know why," Marcus said. "I told Reeves to keep it simple." "When he's in Portland," she said, Tell him. She paused. Tell him yourself. Marcus was quiet. She could see his hands on the steering wheel. Still, flat, the hands of a man holding something carefully. I'm sorry, he said. Not for the first time today, but differently. The earlier apology had been a man reckoning with exposure. This one was a man reckoning with himself. 30 years. What I owed your father, there's no... He stopped. There's no version of it I can make right. No, she said. There isn't. She looked out the window. But you made the call tonight to Parisi. You're going to tell him what I told you to tell him. That matters for what happens next, not for the past. The past is what it is. He nodded. Drive, she said. The afternoon moved. She worked from the car, from the townhouse, from Adiez's office. The endless small mechanical work of a financial and legal operation in motion. The calls and documents and confirmations and adjustments that don't make for a dramatic story, but constitute the actual substance of power. Henri Voss moved the 3 account structures she'd specified. Adiez filed a supplemental FinCEN report incorporating the Harbor Trust transfer data. The SDNY duty attorney called Adiez's line at 3:40 and asked for a meeting the following morning. Cassandra Park called at 4 to confirm the piece was final and locked and going live at 11. At 6:15, Marcus made his call to Parisi. She listened from the study on the 4th floor, the door open, the secondary phone in her hand recording the call on speaker. Marcus's voice was steady. The sovereign's voice, she thought. The quality her father had named, the face and voice of a person who already knows the outcome and is waiting for the other side to catch up. He told Parisi what she had instructed, that the compliance hold at Harbor Trust was temporary and could be cleared with the right internal documentation, that Celestine was moving assets to a new structure in the morning, and that the window for the remaining 7 tranches might reopen by 9 a.m. if DeLuca moved fast. Parisi was quiet for most of the call. When he spoke, it was in the clipped shorthand of a man relaying up a chain in real time. She could hear it, the slight delay of a person who was simultaneously on another line or messaging someone while talking. When the call ended, she looked at the recording and then at Marcus. He bought it, Marcus said. He wanted to buy it, she said. That's not the same thing. DeLuca is smarter than Parisi. He'll verify before he moves. She set the phone down. But verifying takes time. And by the time he finishes verifying, it'll be 11 o'clock. She looked at the clock on the wall. 4 hours and 23 minutes. At 7, Ronan called her personal line. She almost didn't answer. She sat and looked at his name on the screen and thought about all the versions of this call she had imagined over the last 14 months. The angry version, the desperate version, the version where he tried to negotiate, the version where he threatened. She had prepared for all of them. She answered. The DeLuca deal is dead, he said. No greeting. His voice sounded like a man who had been talking on the phone for 6 hours straight, rough and stripped. Marco called me at 2, told me the newspaper piece was running, told me the merger was off. A pause. He told me to find my own way out. She said nothing. Viviana's gone, he said. She's not answering. A long breath. I don't know where she went. She went somewhere safe, Celestine said. That's all you need to know. A silence. You talked to her again. This afternoon. Another silence, longer. She could hear him breathing, the specific, exhausted breath of a man at the absolute bottom of his resources, looking at a landscape that has nothing left in it. I have nothing, he said. You understand that. Literally nothing. The hotel room is on a personal card that has 40,000 left on it. My attorneys... He stopped. Frost dropped me at 4 o'clock. She held the phone and felt the weight of that sentence. Not satisfaction. She had thought there would be satisfaction in this moment, had half expected it, had told herself she wouldn't feel it, and had half believed she was lying to herself. But there was no satisfaction. There was something flatter and more tired than satisfaction. The specific exhaustion of a long thing being over. The child, she said. When it's born, I want you to be present, not for Viviana, not for the DeLuca family, for the child. She paused. That child is going to need a father who isn't defined entirely by what he lost. Start figuring out who that is. Silence on the line so long she thought he'd gone. Why are you saying that to me? He asked. His voice was barely a sound. Because it's the only useful thing left to say, she said. She ended the call. She sat in the study until 8:30, and then she went downstairs and ate something. Actually sat at the kitchen table and ate half a bowl of soup that the household staff had left on the stove, the first real food she'd had since the piece of toast this morning, and stared at the kitchen wall and let her mind go quiet for 17 minutes. The quiet felt like something physical, like setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it was there. Then she went back upstairs and waited. At 10:58, her phone buzzed. Ades. One message. It's live. She pulled up the Financial Tribune on her laptop. The piece ran under Cassandra Park's byline with a headline that was precise and devastating in the way of good journalism. Virelli Empire at center of DeLuca merger scheme. Documents reveal multi-year infiltration of legitimate assets. Eats. 4,000 words. Photographs of documents. The Hoboken meeting records. The merger agreement. The beneficial ownership clause, described in structural terms, no names. The FinCEN filing. The Harbor Trust transfer sequence. She read every word of it. It was accurate. It was complete. It named Marco DeLuca 11 times and Ronan Valieri 9 times and Dario Setti twice in the context of the Hoboken meetings, in language that was careful enough to be legally defensible. It named Gerald Foss and the Harbor Trust transfer. It named Marcus Hale once, in a subordinate clause about DeLuca's network penetration, in language that Adaeze had reviewed and that described his role as compromised access rather than willing participant. She had asked for that framing. She had thought about it for a long time before asking. It was not entirely complete as a description of what Marcus had done, but it was not a lie either. He had been compromised, the debt had been real, the leverage had been genuine. What he had done with the leverage was his responsibility. What she chose to do with the description was hers. At 11:40, her phone rang, a Baltimore area code. She looked at it for 2 rings. She answered, Ms. Virelli. Marco DeLuca's voice was different from this afternoon. Not diminished exactly, but changed. The particular change in a voice when the room has shifted irrevocably and the speaker knows it. The piece is thorough. Park is a good journalist, Celestine said. She is. A pause. The SDNY will move on me by morning. I've spent 40 years in this business, and I know what a morning filing feels like. He was quiet for a moment. You won. She looked at the window, the city outside, the lights. I secured what was mine, she said. That's different from winning. Is it? He asked. She thought about that. Yes, she said. Winning implies the other person was a worthy opponent in a fair contest. This wasn't a fair contest. You had assets inside my household. You had a 4-month head start. You had infrastructure I'm still not fully aware of. She paused. You also had a strategy built around the assumption that I was grieving and disorganized and that Ronan was the actual center of gravity. That assumption was wrong. That's not winning. That's someone else making a critical error. A long silence. Your father made the same distinction, DeLuca said. He told me once, years ago, before any of this, that he had never won anything in his life. He said everything he had because other people kept underestimating what they were dealing with. A pause. I should have remembered that. You should have, she agreed. The 180, he said. It's in a structure I can dismantle with the right arrangement. The SDNY will freeze it anyway once they file. If there's a conversation to be had about returning it, there isn't, she said. Not tonight. Not through me. She paused. If there's a conversation to be had, it's with the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's where it belongs now. Silence. Fair, he said. Just that word. With a weight in it that she recognized. The weight of a man who has run out of moves and is being precise about accepting it. Mr. DeLuca, she said, your daughter and her child are not going to be casualties of this. Whatever happens to you, and I don't know exactly what happens to you, that's not mine to decide. They are separate. I want you to know I made that decision before I knew the outcome of any of this. The silence this time was the longest yet. She could not read it. She had never been able to read Marco DeLuca, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Thank you, he said, very quietly. She ended the call. She sat at the desk for a while. The study was quiet. The city was doing what the city always did. The amber light from the desk lamp was exactly as it had always been in this room, exactly as it had been every night she had sat beside her father while he worked. Every night she had watched him build and protect and plan from the chair where she was sitting now. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk. The encrypted archive was there. The complete documentation of Ronan's betrayal, 14 months of accumulated evidence, the affair, the DeLuca negotiations, the structural mapping he'd obtained from Dario, the communications with Frost about the divorce strategy, the private calendar entries she'd found by accident in a shared cloud account he didn't know she could access. Every piece of it. The complete record of a marriage ending, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small, deliberate choices made by a man who had decided she did not matter. She plugged in the drive. She opened the archive. She looked at it. The file tree. Hundreds of documents. Thousands of pages. The entire architecture of a betrayal. And she sat with it for a moment. She thought about what it would mean to keep it. The ongoing weight of it. The way it would sit in this drawer and in her mind and color every decision with the specific acidic light of documented grievance. She had used it. It had served its purpose. Every piece of leverage it contained had been deployed or rendered unnecessary by the events of the last 48 hours. She selected all. She deleted it. She emptied the trash. She sat for a moment and breathed in the room that smelled of cedar and old paper and the ghost of cigarettes. Then she opened a new document and began to write. Not legal language, not financial structure, not strategy. She wrote the initial framework for what she had been thinking about for months. The Varelli Legacy Foundation, the transformation of the network's legitimate assets into something that operated in daylight. Hospitals, shelters, legal aid, educational grants. The specific focus on women whose invisible labor had built things they would never be credited with. She wrote for an hour and a half. When she stopped, she had 12 pages of framework and a clarity about the work ahead that felt, for the first time in a long time, like something other than survival. At 2 a.m, Marcus knocked on the open door. "Mateo's in Portland," he said. She looked up. "Good." He stood in the doorway. He looked the way he had looked earlier, not diminished, but changed. The particular change of a man who had stepped through something and come out the other side of it knowing he was not the same as he'd been going in. "What happens to me now?" he asked. Not with self-pity, with the directness of a man who needed to know where he stood. She looked at him for a moment. "You work," she said. "We build this thing." She gestured at the 12 pages on the screen. "The foundation needs a security operation. Real security. The kind that protects people, not assets. The kind that knows how networks of harm operate because it's been inside one." She held his eyes. "That's a particular skill set. Hard to find." He was quiet. "After what I did." "After what you did," she confirmed. "I'm not pretending it away. But I'm also not throwing away 30 years of someone who knew my father better than most people ever will because he made a wrong decision in a moment of genuine desperation." She paused. "You'll have to earn it back." "That's not a punishment. It's just accurate." He nodded. Something moved through his face. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. The expression of a man who had expected less and had not yet adjusted to getting more. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be long." He left. She turned back to the screen. 2 weeks later, she stood at a podium in a ballroom on the 42nd floor of a hotel in Midtown, in front of 300 people, philanthropists, activists, journalists, attorneys, women who had built things without being given credit for building them, and she delivered the address that would run in 4 newspapers the following morning. She did not mention Ronan by name. She did not mention DeLuca. She did not mention betrayal or revenge or the 14-month process that had brought her to this podium. She talked about invisible labor, about the women who had held things together in the darkness while other people stood in the light and took the credit, about what it meant to rebuild something from its foundations rather than its surface. The applause, when it came, was the specific applause of people who recognized something true being said plainly. She stood at the podium and looked out at the room and thought about her father. She thought about him teaching her chess at the age of 9 and refusing to let her take a piece back after a bad move. She thought about him standing at the window of the 4th floor study and explaining, patiently and without sentiment, Why silence was the most powerful tool available to anyone willing to learn how to use it. She thought about the last conversation in the room that smelled of cedar, when he had told her she was going to be better at this than he was. She had not believed him then. She believed him now. Not because she had won something, but because she understood finally what he had meant. Better did not mean more powerful. It did not mean more feared or more wealthy or more untouchable. Better meant doing the thing he had done, building structures that protected people, leveraging influence to serve rather than to dominate, but in the daylight instead of the shadows, without the armor of secrecy that had served him and limited him in equal measure. He had ruled from the dark because that was the world he had inherited and the tools he had been given. She had the choice to rule differently. She intended to use it. Later, after the last guests had gone and the room was being cleared and her coat was on and the car was waiting, she stood at the window on the 42nd floor and looked out at the Manhattan skyline, the same skyline her father had watched from 100 different windows for 40 years, and let herself feel the full weight and complexity of what the last few weeks had cost her. The marriage, whatever it had been and whatever she had believed it to be. 7 years of something that had been partly real and partly a structure built on misrepresentation. And the specific grief of that was not simple and was not done. It would not be done for a long time. She was not going to pretend otherwise. The 180 million. Real money, gone. The first significant financial loss of her life as the person responsible for the Virelli assets. It stung in a way she was still processing, not because of the number in isolation, but because of the gap it represented, the things she hadn't seen, the account she hadn't sealed, the 2 hours between the Calder filing and the Harbor Trust discovery where she had not moved fast enough. She would carry that as information. It would make her more thorough. Marcus, and what his betrayal meant about the nature of loyalty and the limits of trust and the way that good people who had spent decades being genuinely valuable, could be turned by the right pressure applied to the right wound. She was not finished thinking about that. She might never be finished thinking about it. And Ronan. She thought about the last call, his voice at the bottom of everything, asking about the child. She thought about what she'd said. Start figuring out who that is. She didn't know if he would. She had run the full length of her ability to predict his behavior, and she had reached the edge of it. What he did next was not something she could engineer. It was his. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. She thought about the encrypted archive, deleted and gone. She thought about the specific sensation of that deletion, not the relief she had expected, but something more neutral. The feeling of a tool being put down when the work is complete. The work was complete. The tool was down. That was enough. She picked up her coat and her phone and walked toward the elevator. In the car going down, she thought about tomorrow. The SDNY meeting that Adaeze had been preparing for all week. The Foundation's first board meeting scheduled for Thursday. The call with Henri Voss about the Harbor Trust frozen assets and the long legal process of establishing DeLuca's liability for the completed tranches. Real work. Grinding, careful, unglamorous work with no guarantee of speed or ease. The elevator doors opened. She walked through the lobby and out into the cold night air. And the car was there, Marcus holding the door with the straightforward professional courtesy of a man who was in the early days of earning something back. She got in. Home, she said. He drove. The city moved past in its lights and noise and indifferent forward momentum. She looked out the window and was quiet and let herself simply be in motion, not planning, not calculating, not preparing for the next move, just moving through the city in the dark. 3 blocks from the townhouse, her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. Naples area code. 1 line of text. No name. She arrived safely. Thank you. Celestine looked at the message for a moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket and watched the street go past and thought about a woman she had never met in person, in a city across an ocean, with a new life beginning in her body, stepping off a plane into air that smelled like salt and stone and something other than everything that had come before. The car stopped in front of the townhouse. She sat for a moment before getting out. The city was what it always was. The buildings and lights and movement and the vast churning human noise of a place that had never once made room for anyone's grief or fear or triumph, that had simply continued regardless of what any one person was carrying. Her father had loved this city for exactly that quality. He had told her once that the city's indifference was a form of honesty, that it reminded you, reliably and without apology, that what you built had to stand on its own. She thought about what she had built, what she was still building, the foundation, the real one, not the financial architecture, but the thing it pointed toward. The reason she had spent 14 months in a room learning to take apart and reconstruct a world. She got out of the car. The November air was cold and clean and entirely real. She stood on the sidewalk in front of her father's townhouse, or her townhouse, and looked up at the lit windows on the fourth floor and breathed, just breathed, the ordinary, irreplaceable act of a person still standing at the end of a long and costly thing. Then she went inside. The study on the fourth floor was warm and quiet. The amber light was on. The desk was clear. She sat in her father's chair and put her hands flat on the surface of the desk and felt the wood, solid and specific and real, beneath her palms. She thought about what he had told her in the last days when his voice had gone thin and his hands had lost their strength, but his eyes had been clearer than ever. The particular clarity of a person who has nothing left to protect except the truth. Real power never announces its victory, he had said. It simply removes the foundation beneath those who mistake borrowed strength for their own. She had watched the foundation go. She had watched Ronan stand on air and discover there was nothing beneath him. She had watched Marco De Luca's careful architecture collapse not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, grinding machinery of law and journalism and the patient accumulation of documented fact. She had not announced the victory. She was not announcing it now. She opened the foundation document she had started 2 nights ago and looked at it for a moment. 12 pages. A beginning. She scrolled to the end and placed the cursor at the last line and thought about what came next. Outside, the city continued. The lights of 1,000 windows pressed against the dark. The traffic moved. The steam rose from the grates. The Hudson ran south in the dark toward the open water, indifferent and constant and entirely real. She began to write.